The clock had barely struck the hour when the palace doors shook with urgency. Staff were whispering frantically in the corridors, their eyes darting toward every shadow as if the walls themselves had ears. A message had arrived, carried in silence, its weight crushing, almost physical. It wasn't a letter for just anyone. It was for the king himself, King Charles. And what it contained could change everything about the royal family as the world knew it. Imagine standing on the edge of history, knowing that in mere minutes, a decision would be made that could strip titles, erase privileges, and rewrite public perception. Would the royal family survive this storm? Or would it shatter from within? The tension was palpable, even through the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. And for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this storm was just beginning. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What could possibly trigger a scenario where the very King of England would consider stripping his own son and daughter-in-law of their royal titles? Some say it was long in the making, a culmination of whispers, leaks, and missteps. Others insist that it was something far more explosive, something hidden from the public eye, concealed in the shadows where palace intrigue meets modern scandal. You might think you know the story, but the reality is far stranger than any tabloid could ever capture. The truth is tangled, emotional, and filled with betrayals that echo through history. And the first shock is just the beginning. It started months ago, behind closed doors. Secret meetings between senior royals, private advisors, and legal teams became increasingly frequent. The whispers of discontent had grown into a chorus of urgent voices, each demanding immediate action. Every member of the family knew that the world was watching, and any wrong move could send shockwaves far beyond the palace walls. But what exactly had pushed King Charles to this point? Was it a breach of trust, an audacious public statement, or perhaps something far more personal, something that cut deeper than any scandal ever could? Imagine the scene. The king's study, warm yet tense, lined with centuries of history. Portraits of past monarchs seemed to glare as though judging every word that would be spoken. Advisors hovered near the edges, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. A file lay on the desk, thick, heavy, sealed with an insignia that immediately signified the gravity of its contents. This was no ordinary communication. This was a declaration in waiting, a document that could change the future of the monarchy forever. And at that moment, even the staff felt the magnitude of the decision about to unfold. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were unaware of the immediacy of the storm about to engulf them. They were living their lives in California, attending events, filming projects, and managing media narratives with calculated precision. But even the most carefully curated public persona cannot shield one from the consequences of actions taken behind the scenes. How could they have anticipated that a letter, a message, or a single phone call could unravel everything they had built? And yet, the first warning had already arrived. A subtle leak in the media, a cryptic statement from a palace spokesperson, a journalist tipped off by a source close to the family. It was enough to send ripples through the public sphere, igniting speculation and controversy before the official decree was ever made. Why now, you might wonder? Timing, as always in the royal family, is everything. It wasn't simply about power or privilege. It was about legacy, reputation, and control over the narrative. King Charles had watched for years as stories about his son and daughter-in-law dominated headlines. He had seen private correspondence mishandled, public appearances misunderstood, and strategic alliances with media outlets gone awry. Every slight, every public misstep, every calculated act designed to reshape the monarchy's image had accumulated into a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And the spark had just been lit. The stakes could not be higher. Stripping titles is not just a symbolic gesture. It carries tangible consequences. Loss of access to certain royal privileges, exclusion from official events, severing of ceremonial roles, and an indelible stain on public perception. To the casual observer, it might appear a simple administrative move, but in reality, it is a seismic shift in family dynamics and national history. The eyes of the world were already fixed on this moment, whether the public realized it or not. Social media feeds buzzed with speculation. Journalists scrambled for every shred of insight. Public opinion teetered between outrage, curiosity, and disbelief. And yet, the full story remained locked behind palace doors, accessible only to a select few. But what about the personal toll? This is more than politics or image. It is a story of family fractured, of loyalties tested, and of emotions running raw. King Charles himself was caught between duty and sentiment. Every decision was weighed against the possibility of personal heartbreak. He knew the implications, not only for the monarchy, but for the man he had once raised. How does a father reconcile love for his child with responsibility to the crown? And how does one navigate the treacherous waters when the world is watching, analyzing every facial expression, every word spoken, every gesture made? The weight of expectation was immense, and yet, action was inevitable. Back in California, Harry and Meghan remained unaware of just how close the precipice had become. They were living in a world that felt controlled, curated, and safe. Yet in reality, the walls of that comfort were crumbling. Messages from friends and allies came with unusual urgency, subtle warnings that something big was coming. Even their own team of advisors was unsettled, unsure of how to convey the gravity of the situation without sparking panic or missteps. The tension was almost cinematic in its intensity, a slow-building storm preparing to crash upon them with unrelenting force. And then, the first signal of what was about to happen reached the media. A cryptic tweet, a brief mention in a broadcast, a seemingly minor leak that, in hindsight, carried the weight of inevitability. The public's curiosity ignited, and speculation spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed possibilities, titles at risk, royal rift deepens, King Charles to take drastic action. The palace, of course, offered no comment. Silence, as always, was strategic. But even silence can speak volumes when tension is high, and the world was listening. As you watch this story unfold, consider this. What would you do if you were caught in a situation where every action was scrutinized, every misstep amplified, and the stakes included not just your reputation, but your identity? How do you defend titles, privileges, and legacies when both the public and your own family are poised to judge every move? The answers, as it turns out, are anything but simple, and they lead us directly to the explosive decisions now being made behind closed doors. What happened next inside the palace would shock even those closest to the situation. Advisors whispered urgently, phones buzzed with updates, and the king prepared to make a decision that could change the monarchy forever. And Harry and Meghan, completely unaware, were about to receive news that would not just shake their world, but send shockwaves around the globe. The question remains, how did we get here, and what exactly will be lost when titles, privileges, and royal status are stripped away? The answers lie ahead, and they are more shocking than anyone could have imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Could you imagine receiving a message that changes your life forever? One letter, one phone call, one whispered word, and suddenly, your world is upended. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, that moment was about to arrive. But long before they even knew, inside the quiet, historic halls of Buckingham Palace, the gears of power had begun turning. The palace was buzzing, not with the usual protocol-driven rhythm of daily life, but with a sense of urgency, of impending storm. Advisors paced the corridors, whispered meetings unfolded behind closed doors, and King Charles sat in his study, a document before him that would set the course for the rest of the year, possibly the rest of his reign. The mini-hook here is simple. Why would a father, a monarch, consider stripping his own son of titles he once bestowed? What could have happened that the king felt compelled to take such a drastic step? Some insiders say the root lies not in one act, but in years of mounting tension, perceived betrayals, and a growing narrative that the monarchy itself was being undermined. Others whisper of something more immediate, something so explosive that even the palace walls seemed to shudder at the thought. It all began with a meeting scheduled at the earliest possible hour. King Charles summoned his most trusted advisors and senior royals, those whose loyalties had been proven over decades, to a private room, the kind reserved for only the gravest matters. The air was thick with anticipation, even fear. This is about the future, one aide reportedly whispered. Not just about titles or privileges. It's about the monarchy itself. You can almost picture it. The king, seated behind a mahogany desk polished by centuries of tradition, glances at each face in turn. Eyes meet eyes. No words are spoken at first, but the tension is palpable. This is not a casual conversation. This is a chess match, and the stakes are nothing less than the survival of the royal institution. Advisors, aides, and courtiers shift uneasily, aware that a single misstep could mean disaster. And yet, all of them know they are here because someone has to bear witness. Someone has to participate in the decision-making that will shake the foundations of royalty. Minutes stretch. The room is silent except for the faint ticking of an ornate clock. Then, the king speaks. His voice calm, measured, but carrying an unmistakable weight. It's come to my attention, he begins, that certain actions have placed the institution we serve in jeopardy. I must take steps, decisive steps, to ensure the stability of the monarchy. The words, though not naming Harry or Meghan, land like a hammer. The aides exchange glances, the implications clear. This is about titles, about status, about everything. And what exactly had precipitated this ultimatum? The answer is both simple and complex. Over the past months, multiple incidents had combined to create a perfect storm. Public statements that embarrassed the monarchy, secretive media deals that bypassed palace protocols, and perceived manipulations designed to shape public opinion. On paper, none of these actions alone would justify such a dramatic response. Taken together, however, they painted a picture of defiance that could not be ignored. For King Charles, it was a question of principle and of authority. Consider the emotional weight here. We often imagine royalty as distant, removed from ordinary human emotions, but the truth is far more nuanced. Even kings and queens experience betrayal, frustration, and heartbreak when family members act against the greater good. To strip someone of a title is more than a bureaucratic act. It is a personal declaration. It says, in effect, that trust has been broken, that privileges once freely given are now revoked, and that consequences are real and lasting. Can you imagine what it feels like to face that? To know that your position, your status, and perhaps your very identity could be erased in an instant? Yet even in this charged atmosphere, there was strategy at play. King Charles did not act rashly. Advisors presented detailed briefings, outlining potential fallout, legal ramifications, and public perception risks. Each scenario was examined meticulously. How would media outlets react? Would public opinion swing in favor of the monarchy or against it? What about international perception? Every angle was analyzed, every risk assessed. And yet, as anyone familiar with high-stakes decision-making knows, no preparation can fully predict human response. The tension mounted as advisors laid out the evidence, carefully documented incidents, inconsistencies in public statements, and actions interpreted as undermining the royal family. One could almost see the room collectively holding its breath. The stakes were monumental. This was more than a family feud. This was about the monarchy's reputation, its authority, and its survival in the eyes of the public. And then came the suggestion that would change everything, stripping Harry and Meghan of their royal titles. At first, some advisors recoiled. Could such an action be justified? Was it legal? What precedent would it set? But as the discussion progressed, the logic became unavoidable. The king had to act decisively. The monarchy was more than a family. It was an institution that could not tolerate repeated challenges to its authority. Now, imagine being the courier tasked with delivering this decision. A sealed envelope, emblazoned with the royal insignia, containing a message that could reshape lives. Every step from the palace to the recipient carried weight, gravity, and the risk of exposure. And for Harry and Meghan, the moment of reckoning was approaching faster than they could anticipate. The letter, the call, the summons, it was coming. And with it, a tidal wave of consequences. You may wonder, why the secrecy? Why the careful orchestration? Because in the world of royalty, perception is everything. Every move is scrutinized, every word analyzed, and every gesture interpreted. Leaks, rumors, or premature disclosure could escalate a situation beyond control. So the king and his advisors maintained a tight circle, ensuring that the decision would be conveyed with precision, authority, and maximum impact. But even within this meticulously planned environment, tension persisted. Not everyone agreed on the course of action. Some advisors worried about public backlash, about the narrative being spun by sympathetic media. Others argued that failure to act would signal weakness, inviting further defiance. King Charles weighed each opinion carefully. He understood that this was more than a decision about titles. It was a decision that could define his legacy and, by extension, the stability of the monarchy itself. As the hours passed, the palace transformed into a hive of discreet activity. Security teams were on high alert. Communications staff prepared for every eventuality. Legal advisors drafted potential statements. Every detail mattered. Every precaution was taken to ensure that when the announcement finally came, it would be precise, calculated, and inescapable. And yet, outside these walls, Harry and Meghan continued their daily lives, unaware of the storm bearing down on them. Could they have imagined that a father's ultimatum, conceived in secrecy, could reach across the ocean to disrupt their carefully constructed reality? Could they have anticipated that privileges, titles, and the very recognition they had taken for granted could be withdrawn at a moment's notice? The contrast between the calm of their world and the intensity inside the palace could not have been starker. Now, consider the emotional complexity. For King Charles, this decision was not simply administrative, it was personal. He had raised his son, guided him, and yet faced the painful realization that guidance had not been heeded. For Meghan, the challenge was different, navigating a foreign institution while protecting personal ambition and influence. The collision of these trajectories created a tension that would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. As night fell over London, the final preparations were made. Advisors reviewed messages one last time. Security confirmed procedures. Legal contingencies were double-checked. And in the quiet of the king's study, Charles looked at the sealed envelope once more. Its contents represented the culmination of months of deliberation, planning, and tension. When delivered, it would signal an irreversible shift. But what would Harry and Meghan do when they received the notice? Would they accept the decision, fight it, or attempt to manipulate public perception to their advantage? And more importantly, what hidden elements, unknown to the public, could complicate the outcome even further? The palace held its breath. The world waited. In a single moment, one phone call, one meeting, one letter, was about to change everything. And what came next would not just redefine Harry and Meghan's roles, it could redefine the monarchy itself. Could you imagine opening your door to a message that feels like it was written to dismantle your entire world? That is exactly what awaited Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in the quiet of their California home. The envelope wasn't just paper and ink. It was a declaration of fate, a tangible proof that the king's decision had finally reached across the Atlantic. But before we dive into their reaction, pause for a moment and ask yourself, how would you respond if everything you thought secure, your titles, privileges, even your identity, was suddenly threatened? Inside the house, life seemed ordinary. Cameras for projects were packed up. Daily routines continued. But the atmosphere had begun to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly. A sense of unease had taken root. A whisper of urgency passed down by advisors who sensed that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Even the household staff, loyal yet discreet, noticed it. Phones buzzed with cryptic alerts. Emails flagged urgent. Every message seemed designed to build anticipation, tension, and, unknowingly, panic. When the envelope arrived, the air changed instantly. Meghan, ever meticulous, noticed it first. She held it in her hands, a simple sheet of stationery embossed with a royal crest, yet carrying implications more weighty than the heaviest crown. Harry glanced over her shoulder, sensing the gravity without knowing the details. There was no dramatic flourish, no fanfare. Just a quiet, almost cruel silence, the kind that amplifies dread. What's fascinating here is the human response under pressure. Harry's reaction was immediate yet layered. First came confusion. The wording, careful and deliberate, hinted at consequences, obligations, and authority without revealing every detail. Then came disbelief. Could this be real? Could his father, his own blood, truly consider stripping him and Meghan of titles they had carried for years? Then came fear, a gnawing uncertainty about what lay ahead, about how the world would react, and whether there was any path to redemption. Meghan's reaction, however, was more calculated. She had always been strategic, measuring public perception against private maneuvering. Her eyes scanned the document, noting phrasing, implications, and potential leverage points. Could she spin this? Could she redirect the narrative before it reached the tabloids, the social media feeds, the global audience waiting for scandal? There was a flurry of thoughts racing simultaneously: crisis management, legal options, media strategy. Every instinct honed over years in Hollywood and public life was now being tested against the raw power of monarchy. And yet, despite the strategic mind, emotional spikes could not be contained. There was anger, a deep, almost primal irritation at the audacity of the palace, at the assumption that they could be contained, disciplined, or controlled. There was betrayal, not just from the king, but from the system, the institution that Harry and Meghan had believed they could navigate, mold, or even challenge. And there was fear, the sort that keeps you awake at night, imagining scenarios, anticipating reactions, and questioning loyalties. Let's pause here. Think about the contradictions at play. On one hand, Harry and Meghan had publicly positioned themselves as champions of independence, critics of the monarchy's outdated traditions. On the other, they were entirely reliant on the very titles and privileges that now hung in jeopardy. Can you see the irony? They had fought for autonomy, yet autonomy had consequences, and the system they challenged was responding decisively. In the immediate aftermath of receiving the notice, a series of private conversations unfolded. Between husband and wife, between them and their advisors, between them and their closest allies. Words were measured, yet urgency cut through every sentence. Advisors outlined legal implications. Strategists suggested controlled leaks. Friends offered sympathetic counsel. But the underlying question remained: how could they respond without losing everything, without public humiliation, and without irreparable damage to family relationships? One particularly tense moment occurred when Harry suggested reaching out directly to King Charles. Should they confront the king, plead their case, or attempt to negotiate terms? Could a son successfully persuade his father not to enact a decision already set in motion by senior royals? Meghan, ever pragmatic, cautioned restraint. Public emotion can be your enemy, she warned. Every action, every reaction will be scrutinized. Timing is everything. The tension between instinctive emotional response and calculated strategy defined the next several hours. Meanwhile, the media was beginning to catch wind of unusual activity. Reporters noticed subtle changes in social media activity, cryptic comments from royal correspondents, and an unusual spike in palace-related coverage. These observations, though minor at first, created a feedback loop of speculation that threatened to spin out of control. For Harry and Meghan, this meant that even in the privacy of their home, they were no longer fully insulated. Public perception was a pressure cooker, and every second mattered. Now consider this. The envelope itself was just the first salvo. It was both symbolic and procedural. Its contents hinted at consequences, but left gaps that advisors immediately recognized as both opportunity and risk. A well-crafted strategy could exploit those gaps, but missteps could exacerbate the situation, making the eventual outcome far more severe. The psychological tension was nearly unbearable. Harry felt cornered. Meghan felt challenged. Every heartbeat carried the weight of the decision that awaited them, and the decisions themselves would ripple far beyond the walls of their residence. In the hours that followed, they debated how to respond publicly, or whether to respond at all. Should they issue a statement? Should they leak a carefully crafted version of events to sympathetic media outlets? Or should they remain silent, waiting for the palace to act first? Each option carried profound risk. Silence could be interpreted as acquiescence or fear. A statement could ignite backlash. A leak could inflame tensions irreparably. The balance was razor-thin. Adding another layer of complexity were the personal dynamics at play. Harry felt the weight of being the son of a reigning monarch. Meghan navigated the pressures of being both a public figure and an outsider in the royal hierarchy. The emotional contradictions were stark: loyalty versus independence, public image versus private truth, love versus power. Could they reconcile these forces and act decisively? The answer was uncertain, and every passing minute intensified the pressure. Yet even as they considered the options, new information arrived. Advisors had intercepted whispers from the palace, rumors about potential timing, hints that senior royals were pushing for immediate action. The clock was ticking, and the window for maneuvering was shrinking. A misstep could lead not only to public embarrassment, but to the irreversible loss of titles, privileges, and perhaps even access to family. The reality was chilling. Every plan had to account for multiple contingencies. Every response had to be measured, and even then, outcomes were unpredictable. So what did they do? First, they convened an emergency call with trusted advisors. Strategies were outlined, messages drafted, contingencies considered. Legal counsel emphasized procedural nuance, timelines, authority, and potential loopholes. Media strategists emphasized framing, how to present their narrative to minimize fallout. Every angle was considered, yet every plan contained elements beyond their control. And here is the twist. Even as they deliberated, palace insiders were not waiting. Staff had been briefed, protocols were in motion, and the machinery of the monarchy was preparing to implement the decision. Harry and Meghan's responses, no matter how carefully crafted, would be entering a system already set in motion. The tension between preparation and inevitability created a palpable sense of dread. How could they respond effectively when the outcome was already being sealed behind palace walls? At the center of this storm, personal emotions collided with strategic imperatives. Fear, anger, betrayal, and pride intertwined in a complex web of psychological tension. Harry felt a mixture of resentment and desperation. Meghan balanced outrage with tactical thinking. They debated whether to confront the palace, to negotiate, to appeal publicly, or to quietly accept the impending consequences. Every choice carried weight. Every word spoken could be interpreted as either defiance or submission. And the ultimate question loomed. Could they influence the king's decision? Or was the ultimatum already irreversible? The palace had coordinated the sequence of events with precision. Advisors ensured that every step, every communication, and every reaction would advance the narrative and enforce consequences. Harry and Meghan's options, though seemingly many, were tightly constrained by the dynamics set in motion by the monarchy. And as night deepened over California, the tension reached its peak. A message arrived, cryptic, concise, and terrifying in its implications. It was not the final word, not yet, but it confirmed that the palace's intention was clear. Action would be taken imminently. There was no room for delay, no opportunity for negotiation. The king's decision, backed by senior royals and advisors, would move forward. The question now hung in the air. How would Harry and Meghan respond to a reality that was closing in faster than they could anticipate? Would they act with strategy, with emotion, or with desperation? And perhaps most importantly, what unforeseen complications were already unfolding that even the most careful advisors had failed to predict? The moment of response was approaching, and the consequences would reverberate far beyond what either of them could imagine. And what came next would not just define their future, it could redefine the entire monarchy. What happens when the walls of Buckingham Palace aren't as secure as they seem? When whispers in the hallways become stories, and confidential discussions are carried beyond the gilded doors to ears that should never hear them? That is the question that now haunted the monarchy. While Harry and Meghan were thousands of miles away, wrestling with their imminent fate, inside London, a different kind of storm was brewing. A storm of insider leaks, secrets spilling into the wrong hands, and a truth that could ignite chaos faster than any official decree. It began subtly. A junior staffer, overlooked and underestimated, noticed irregularities in daily routines, meetings scheduled at odd hours, high-security couriers moving with unusual urgency, phone calls ending abruptly when someone entered the room. To the casual observer, these details were insignificant. But to someone attuned to palace rhythms, they signaled something massive was about to unfold. Soon, rumors reached journalists known for their proximity to the palace, and the first fragments of what insiders were calling a royal reckoning began to circulate. The leaks weren't accidental. Some insiders felt frustrated, ignored, or fearful. Others sought leverage, a way to ensure their own security or influence outcomes. And then there were those whose motivations were harder to decipher. Loyalists who believed that exposing the truth would force swift action, or at least prepare the public for what was coming. The point is this. Once the chain of secrecy was broken, information flowed like a river, impossible to contain. One anonymous source revealed, "The anger inside Buckingham Palace is unlike anything I've seen. There's frustration, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal. Senior royals are furious not just at Harry and Meghan, but at the audacity to think they could operate independently of the institution that made them who they are. Think about that for a moment. The fury wasn't just procedural. It was emotional, visceral, and deeply personal. The monarchy isn't just a system. It's a family bound by duty, history, and tradition. When those bonds are perceived as broken, the backlash can be devastating. Consider the contradictions here. On one hand, the royal family projects an image of unshakable authority, calm, and composure. On the other, the reality behind closed doors is raw and chaotic. Advisors whisper urgent counsel. Princes and princesses exchange pointed glances. Legal teams prepare contingencies. Media strategists speculate and leak selectively. Every piece of information, every decision, every reaction is monitored and evaluated. And yet, even amidst all this planning, human emotion seeps in, unpredictable and uncontrollable. The leaks began to paint a vivid picture of the internal state of the monarchy. Sources described heated debates among senior royals, arguments over timing, and disputes about the severity of consequences. One aide reportedly argued, "We can't afford to appear weak. If Harry and Meghan think they can manipulate public opinion or play the media, the monarchy loses credibility." Another countered, "We need to balance firmness with compassion. The public will judge us harshly if this appears vindictive." These internal disagreements, while procedural, underscored the emotional tension at play. Every action had to consider optics, loyalty, and the weight of history. And then came the most explosive leaks, snippets of private conversations, email threads, and even recordings. Details emerged that hinted at frustration that went beyond policy or protocol. There were references to repeated disregard for family counsel, public manipulation of media narratives, and even comments questioning whether loyalty to the monarchy could be assumed at all. These revelations were incendiary, designed, or at least consequentially, to inflame public perception and escalate pressure on Harry and Meghan. Yet, within these leaks, contradictions abounded. Some sources insisted that the king himself preferred discretion, advocating for private negotiations. Others suggested that the senior royals were pushing for immediate, public action to send a message. The effect was a tense, almost cinematic tug-of-war within the palace walls. Tradition versus pragmatism, authority versus personal loyalty, secrecy versus transparency. The leaks exposed that the decision to strip titles wasn't just administrative. It was political, strategic, and deeply personal. As the world's media outlets began to pick up these fragments, speculation ran rampant. Headlines appeared, "Royal rift deepens. King Charles prepares to strip titles. Palace in chaos over Sussex controversy." Social media amplified these reports exponentially. Twitter threads, viral TikToks, and Instagram stories transformed internal tensions into global spectacle. Harry and Meghan, still grappling with the initial letter, were now confronted not only with the potential consequences of the king's decision, but with a world watching their every move. Behind the scenes, palace staff scrambled to contain the leaks, but control was slipping. The monarchy's historical emphasis on discretion, confidentiality, and internal problem-solving was being challenged by the immediacy and virality of the modern media landscape. Every staff meeting now carried the risk of another breach. Every phone call could be recorded, every casual comment analyzed. The palace was navigating uncharted territory, where centuries-old tradition collided violently with real-time digital exposure. Meanwhile, insiders provided tantalizing hints of the hotspots fueling the royal anger. Certain public appearances, controversial interviews, and media deals were cited as particularly inflammatory. Advisors noted that these actions not only embarrassed the monarchy, but also created precedents that could inspire similar defiance from other members of the family. "If we don't act decisively," one source reportedly warned, "it sets a dangerous example." The pressure to act was mounting, intensifying the urgency of the situation. The emotional layer of these leaks cannot be understated. Royal anger was described as multifaceted, a combination of disappointment, frustration, and protective instinct. On one hand, there was the personal anger of a father whose son appeared to challenge his authority. On the other, there was the institutional anger, a need to defend centuries of tradition against perceived subversion. The palace's actions, while carefully measured, were driven by this intertwined web of emotion and strategy. And then came the most damaging leak of all, an excerpt suggesting that some senior royals felt Harry and Meghan had exploited their titles for personal gain. Whether through media projects, public appearances, or private business ventures, the perception of self-interest at the expense of family loyalty was enough to tip the scales toward extreme measures. Suddenly, the potential stripping of titles was no longer a hypothetical, it was an inevitability. But even with this mounting pressure, uncertainty remained. Would the public side with tradition or with the couple? How would international media frame the story? Could Harry and Meghan craft a narrative to counter the palace's message? Every factor had consequences, and the stakes were global, personal, and institutional all at once. The monarchy was under pressure like never before. Then, a new twist arrived. One source claimed that confidential communications suggested Harry and Meghan were preparing a response, potentially even a media strategy that could preempt or undermine the king's actions. This revelation sent shockwaves through the palace. The very subjects of the ultimatum were already mobilizing, possibly threatening to turn the decision into a public spectacle before the institution could control the narrative. The tension skyrocketed. Every move was now a gamble. At this moment, consider the gravity. The leaks weren't just information, they were catalysts. They inflamed anger, forced urgency, and created conditions where a single misstep could lead to public scandal. The palace was no longer operating in a vacuum. The world was watching, insiders were speaking, and the monarchy's private deliberations had become a public drama with global stakes. The leaks also revealed surprising contradictions. Some insiders expressed sympathy for Harry and Meghan, suggesting the couple had been unfairly targeted. Others painted them as manipulators, fully aware of the consequences, yet seemingly indifferent. The public narrative, amplified by leaks, was already shaping opinion before any formal action had been taken. For the king and his advisors, this created a paradox. Act decisively and risk appearing cruel, or delay and risk being perceived as weak. And here's the twist nobody could ignore. Some leaks hinted at internal divisions, suggesting that even within the palace, opinions on the course of action were split. Certain senior royals reportedly advocated for negotiation and private resolution. Others demanded immediate, irreversible measures. The palace was a house divided, and the leaks had turned internal debate into global speculation. The clock was ticking. The pressure on King Charles to act had never been greater. Every leak, every insider tip, and every hint of public expectation added weight to a decision that had already been months in the making. And far away, Harry and Meghan were still grappling with the implications of a letter that had already set their world into motion. Have you ever wondered what happens when private chaos becomes public spectacle? When calculated decisions, internal fury, and whispered ultimatums collide with the relentless gaze of global media. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the reality of their situation was about to explode from palace secrecy into a worldwide crisis. The leaks, the letters, the private meetings, all of it had primed a perfect storm, and the first shockwaves were about to hit the public sphere. But what happens when a family drama becomes a public scandal? And how do you navigate when every headline, every tweet, every viral clip is a weapon in its own right? It started innocuously enough. The initial leaks and insider whispers had already made their way into obscure media outlets. Social media chatter amplified them, creating speculation that spread faster than any official announcement. The curious public was hungry for details. Headlines hinted at royal rifts, at possible title revocations, at a family torn apart from within. But the real disaster lay not in the facts themselves, but in the perception. Public perception, once shaped, becomes an uncontrollable force, and Harry and Meghan were about to experience its full intensity. Consider this. The royal family's image has been meticulously curated over centuries. Every gesture, every appearance, every smile is strategically deployed to communicate authority, dignity, and tradition. Yet even the most carefully managed institutions can be derailed when private conflicts spill into public view. Within hours of the leaks, hashtags were trending, opinion pieces proliferated, and YouTube channels dedicated to royal news exploded with speculative videos. Within minutes, a personal family dispute had become a global narrative, and Harry and Meghan were at the center of it. Harry, naturally, felt the weight immediately. Every news alert on his phone was a reminder that the world was watching him navigate a crisis not of his making. Or perhaps it was, depending on who you asked. Public judgment, unlike private counsel, is merciless and instantaneous. Every misstep, every reaction, every social media post was now under scrutiny. And for Meghan, the stakes were equally intense. Her carefully constructed public persona, a combination of glamour, charisma, and strategic advocacy, was suddenly being examined through a lens she could neither control nor predict. The irony was striking. They had spent years cultivating an image of independence and authenticity, challenging royal traditions while maintaining their personal brand. And now, the very world that admired their independence was dissecting their every move, interpreting defiance as hubris, strategy as manipulation, and ambition as betrayal. It's a cruel paradox. To act publicly is to risk misinterpretation. To remain silent is to invite speculation. Neither path is safe, yet both demand navigation. At the same time, palace communications teams were scrambling to manage damage. Press officers, media strategists, and communications advisors coordinated behind the scenes, crafting statements designed to convey control without appearing reactive. But the speed of social media, combined with the appetite for scandal, meant that any misstep could, and would, be magnified. Already, memes circulated mocking the couple. Opinion polls began to fluctuate. International coverage picked up the story with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. The public image disaster had begun, and the consequences were cascading faster than anyone could control. One particularly striking example involved a seemingly innocent comment Harry had made during a charity event months prior. Taken out of context, amplified by social media, and juxtaposed against the unfolding scandal, it became a flashpoint. Critics framed it as arrogance, while supporters defended it as humor. But in the court of public opinion, context is often irrelevant. The narrative moves faster than nuance, and for Harry and Meghan, the stakes were existential. Reputational damage, public judgment, and the looming threat of lost titles all converged in the same moment. And then there was Meghan's media presence. From carefully curated interviews to public appearances, everything she had done was suddenly analyzed under the lens of this royal crisis. Was her advocacy genuine or performative? Was her independence a challenge to tradition or a personal power play? Every gesture, every quote, every carefully photographed moment was dissected, critiqued, and circulated in ways that created a feedback loop of scrutiny. Social media users, journalists, and influencers collectively shaped a narrative that the palace itself was struggling to manage. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan attempted to maintain composure, but even private moments were not immune to public interpretation. Staff anecdotes, minor scheduling changes, and even casual social media updates were spun into evidence of internal turmoil. The media, hungry for clicks and virality, transformed every action into fodder for speculation. And the couple, isolated thousands of miles from the decision-makers, faced an impossible challenge, responding without inflaming the situation further. What's critical to understand here is the psychological pressure. The human mind is not designed to process simultaneous personal crisis, public judgment, and global attention. Anxiety spikes, emotions amplify, and decision-making can become impaired. For Harry and Meghan, this wasn't hypothetical, it was reality. Every phone notification, every news alert, every media headline became a psychological weight, reminding them that the palace's decision was imminent and irreversible. And the consequences of missteps were magnified by contradictions in public expectation. Supporters of the couple demanded fairness and empathy. Critics demanded accountability and tradition. Every word they spoke could be weaponized by one camp or another, and the palace, while executing a strategic plan, had to anticipate these responses, calculate timing, and manage the optics across multiple platforms. It was a chess game in real time, with billions of spectators and infinite variables. At the same time, the situation exposed weaknesses in media strategy. Attempts to frame the narrative often backfired. Statements intended to clarify only fueled speculation. Carefully scheduled posts were misinterpreted, leading to viral moments that exacerbated public scrutiny. The palace, though historically skilled in managing public image, found itself reacting to a digital ecosystem that operates at a speed no monarchy had ever faced. And then came the international dimension. Royal news is global news, and outlets from Europe, Asia, and the Americas picked up the story instantly. Analysts debated motives, historians speculated on precedent, and commentators drew connections to past royal crises. Public perception was no longer local, it was global. Harry and Meghan were now not just American celebrities or British royals. They were international figures, their every action dissected across continents. Here's the paradox. While the public image disaster was partly fueled by the couple's own actions and decisions, it was also exacerbated by forces beyond their control. Leaks, timing, media interpretation, and social media amplification combined to create a scenario where perception often diverged sharply from reality. The consequences, however, were real. Titles, privileges, and reputations were all on the line. As the situation escalated, Harry and Meghan realized that they could no longer remain passive. Strategic calls were made. Media teams mobilized. Legal advisors outlined contingencies. But every response carried risk. Every decision could backfire, and the pressure intensified with every hour. The stakes were monumental, not just public perception, but tangible losses and long-term damage to personal and professional identities. And yet, the drama had only just begun. The leaks, the public speculation, and the pressure from senior royals were converging in ways that even the most prepared advisors could not fully anticipate. Every move Harry and Meghan made would be scrutinized, every response would generate headlines, and every interaction had the potential to exacerbate the crisis. So, what came next would push the boundaries of public image, private crisis, and institutional authority to the breaking point. The palace had set the stage, the world was watching, and Harry and Meghan were about to confront the most intense scrutiny of their lives. The disaster was unfolding, and it was far from over. Could a streaming deal really cost someone their royal titles? It sounds impossible, almost absurd. But in the case of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Netflix factor was proving to be one of the most explosive elements in the unfolding saga. While the palace was preparing to act, and the public was reacting to leaks, the canceled or controversial media projects became a potent symbol of defiance, independence, and, according to insiders, insubordination. And for the king and senior royals, it wasn't just about money. It was about power, perception, and precedent. The saga begins with a contract that, on the surface, appeared lucrative and harmless. A multi-million-dollar deal with Netflix, promising documentaries, specials, and other content featuring the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. To Harry and Meghan, it represented autonomy, a path to influence, and financial security. But in the eyes of the palace, it represented something far more complex and threatening. Here was a public endeavor operating outside traditional royal oversight, with the potential to broadcast narratives that could contradict, undermine, or even embarrass the institution. Could the couple be trusted with that level of control over their story? Or was the risk too high? Given their history of media manipulation, the controversy intensified when a leak revealed discussions about the content's scope, timing, and subject matter. Some sources suggested that scripts and topics were being prepared that directly referenced the monarchy, including personal insights, internal anecdotes, and possibly even private opinions on royal family dynamics. To insiders, this crossed a line. It wasn't merely entertainment. It was influence and potentially defiance. The palace was not accustomed to such public exposure from its own members, and it was precisely this defiance that fueled the decision to strip titles. Imagine the stakes. Harry and Meghan had invested significant time and resources in these projects. They had cultivated production teams, strategized publicity campaigns, and even prepared marketing collateral. Yet, despite all this, the palace viewed the initiative not as entrepreneurship, but as a potential threat. Here lay the paradox. Independence for the couple equaled disruption for the institution. Every interview, every production meeting, every teaser trailer became a flashpoint, a potential misstep in the eyes of those tasked with preserving royal tradition. The irony did not escape observers. Harry and Meghan had publicly championed transparency, social causes, and independent work. And yet, in striving to assert autonomy, they had simultaneously heightened scrutiny. The palace, sensing a narrative forming, acted preemptively. Conversations in the king's study emphasized urgency. "If we allow this to continue unchecked," one advisor reportedly said, "it sets a precedent that no royal can ignore." Titles aren't just honorifics, they're tools of responsibility. Every word carried significance. Every phrase weighed on the balance of tradition versus modernity. But the Netflix factor wasn't just symbolic, it was financial. The reported $100 million deal became a public talking point, a demonstration of influence and reach that some argued was incompatible with royal neutrality. Social media pundits debated the optics. Was this a power grab, a savvy media strategy, or reckless self-promotion? And the public opinion, fueled by viral posts and analyst commentary, amplified the pressure. Headlines screamed, "Sussex deal sparks palace fury. Royal titles at risk over media contracts. Streaming empire threatens monarchy." The world was watching, and the narrative was shaping itself in real time. Inside the palace, advisors dissected every angle. Legal teams explored whether titles and privileges could be retained while allowing the couple to continue with media projects. Public relations teams simulated scenarios in which leaks or content releases could coincide with official palace statements. Every possible contingency was examined, every potential domino anticipated. The pressure on King Charles to act decisively had never been greater, and the Netflix deal had become a lightning rod, accelerating an already tense situation. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan attempted to maintain control over the narrative. They explored media-friendly responses, strategized selective disclosures, and even considered delaying or modifying project releases. But the reality was harsh. No amount of strategy could neutralize the combination of palace fury, public scrutiny, and media frenzy. The deal, meant to secure independence, had inadvertently intensified the crisis. And the irony was stark. What they thought would elevate their brand and influence was now being cited as evidence of disloyalty and recklessness. One particularly dramatic twist involved leaked negotiations. A confidential communication, reportedly intercepted by palace insiders, suggested that Harry and Meghan were discussing content ideas that could embarrass or reveal private dynamics within the royal family. The mere suggestion sent shockwaves among advisors. Suddenly, the question was no longer hypothetical. Could this media initiative directly threaten the monarchy's reputation? The answer, from the perspective of senior royals, was alarmingly clear: yes. And yet, there were contradictions. Not all observers, even within the palace, agreed on the severity of the Netflix factor. Some argued that media engagement could be managed, leveraged, or even tolerated. Others insisted it was the final straw, a culmination of missteps, leaks, and perceived disloyalty. The tension between conservative caution and progressive pragmatism intensified internal debate, and every second of delay carried risk. Consider the human element. For Harry, the deal represented independence, freedom, and control over his narrative. For Meghan, it was a demonstration of agency and personal brand strength. And yet, both were now caught in a paradox. The very tools they employed to assert autonomy had become evidence against them. The emotional spike was profound. Betrayal, frustration, and disbelief intertwined with strategic calculation. Could they continue to defend the deal while facing potential title revocation? Could they assert agency without further angering the palace? The situation was exacerbated by media amplification. Analysts, pundits, and social media commentators parsed every statement, every production update, every prior interview. Context became irrelevant. Perception dominated. Supporters framed the deal as entrepreneurial and independent. Critics framed it as disrespectful, opportunistic, and antagonistic. The narrative, once internal and private, had escaped completely into the public sphere, leaving Harry and Meghan navigating a high-stakes reality with global audiences scrutinizing every move. And then came the financial implications. While titles were symbolic, the lost opportunity to exercise autonomy over media ventures added a layer of tangible consequence. Losing a deal or facing restrictions on content creation threatened income streams, public influence, and even future career trajectories. This elevated the stakes further. It wasn't merely about public perception or familial relationships. It was about long-term security and legacy. As the palace moved closer to action, the Netflix factor became a central justification in the public narrative. Advisors emphasized that the couple's engagement with external media ventures, especially those with potential to influence public opinion about the monarchy, could not continue without oversight. The titles, once seen as ceremonial rewards, were now positioned as instruments of responsibility. The implication was stark. Autonomy comes with accountability, and accountability was the one thing Harry and Meghan were about to face in the harshest possible way. And yet, the drama didn't stop there. Reports began circulating that Netflix executives themselves were nervous. Sources suggested the company monitored public sentiment, aware that the deal's association with an unfolding royal scandal could affect branding, viewership, and investor confidence. The layers of consequence were multiplying. Palace politics, public perception, media narratives, and corporate interest all intertwined in a complex, combustible web. For Harry and Meghan, the pressure was relentless. Every call, every email, every strategy session was overshadowed by the looming possibility of title revocation. The deal they had believed would empower them now amplified the threat against them, creating a tension that was both psychological and practical. Could they navigate this landscape without losing everything? Could they salvage their reputation, their titles, or even their relationship with the monarchy? The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. And then came the final twist that would escalate the crisis further. Insider sources hinted that some of the planned content could be released immediately, potentially colliding with the timing of the palace's official decision. The possibility of a public spectacle, content airing while titles were being revoked, created a scenario that terrified palace advisors and thrilled media outlets. The situation had escalated from internal deliberation to an unavoidable, high-stakes drama that could redefine royal protocol, public perception, and family relationships. But what came next would push the boundaries even further. The palace, Harry and Meghan, Netflix, and the global audience were all about to converge in a moment of tension that no one could predict and no one would forget. What would you do if you were caught between a powerful institution and a world watching your every move? For Meghan Markle, the stakes had never been higher. The envelope from Buckingham Palace had arrived. Leaks were circulating, public opinion was exploding, and the Netflix factor was creating pressure from every direction. Every action she took, every statement she made, and every strategic decision was scrutinized, dissected, and often weaponized. The question hanging over her head was relentless. How do you maneuver in a world where every move could either save or destroy you? From the moment the palace's intentions became clear, Meghan's instincts kicked in. She was never a passive participant in her own story. Every advisor she consulted, every lawyer she contacted, and every media strategist she engaged was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. But there was a difference between planning and improvisation. The palace's moves were deliberate, strategic, and backed by centuries of precedent. Meghan's maneuvers had to match, and sometimes anticipate, that level of precision. Her first step was control of narrative. Meghan understood that perception was as important, if not more, than fact. She knew that global audiences were watching, that every media outlet was poised to broadcast both misinterpretation and exaggeration, and that the palace's communications team was orchestrating a counter-narrative designed to shape opinion. To act effectively, she needed to seize the narrative, reclaim agency, and create a framework in which she and Harry could respond without appearing reactive or desperate. Consider her options. On one hand, she could remain silent, allowing the palace to dictate the story and risk being portrayed as passive, guilty, or acquiescent. On the other, she could respond publicly, crafting statements, interviews, or media engagements to assert autonomy. But that carried the risk of inflaming anger, creating leaks, or violating legal boundaries. Every choice was a double-edged sword. Meghan had to calculate timing, tone, and content with precision. And so she began maneuvering strategically, both publicly and privately. She convened private calls with advisors to map out contingency plans. Legal teams reviewed every potential interpretation of palace letters, communications, and precedents for title revocation. Media experts drafted messaging for various scenarios: silent compliance, measured response, controlled leaks, or full public engagement. Every path had risks, but every path had potential leverage points. One of the most fascinating aspects of her strategy was her use of timing. Meghan understood that in high-stakes crises, timing can be as important as content. Statements delivered too early might preempt or contradict the palace's actions. Delays could allow leaks to dominate the narrative. She had to calculate not just what to say, but when to say it, and how to ensure her message resonated before misinformation spread. It was a game of timing and influence, and one misstep could trigger irreversible consequences. At the same time, Meghan managed interpersonal dynamics within their team. Harry was anxious, concerned about both public perception and familial fallout. Staff and advisors were tense, balancing loyalty, professional judgment, and fear of missteps. Meghan assumed the role of strategist, mediator, and decision-maker, orchestrating meetings and guiding conversations. Every discussion reinforced her understanding that perception, narrative, and control were essential weapons in this battle. She also navigated the complex dynamic of public empathy. Meghan knew that while titles could be stripped and privileges revoked, public support could serve as a shield. Social media sentiment, sympathetic commentators, and loyal fan bases could influence how the world viewed the unfolding drama. Carefully timed posts, subtle media engagements, and curated appearances were all part of a broader strategy to maintain visibility, credibility, and leverage in the narrative. But her maneuvers weren't limited to optics. They were operational as well. Behind closed doors, Meghan and her advisors explored every contingency. Legal appeals, negotiation strategies with the palace, private communications with sympathetic insiders, and potential alternative media strategies. Every decision was weighed for both immediate impact and long-term consequences. Could she secure temporary reprieve? Could she influence the timing of announcements? Could she soften the impact of title revocation? These questions dominated internal discussions. Contradictions emerged, however. Meghan had to balance assertiveness with diplomacy, action with patience, visibility with discretion. Every move carried dual consequences. A statement could empower or inflame, silence could protect or isolate, engagement could persuade or provoke. The emotional tension was immense. Anger, fear, pride, and determination intertwined, creating a volatile mix that shaped decision-making. One of the more dramatic maneuvers involved the Netflix factor. Meghan understood that media projects could serve as both leverage and liability. Content timing, marketing strategy, and messaging were adjusted to anticipate palace responses. Every announcement